We have another period of time now where we're going to do some Q&A. We've actually received quite a few on the cards. I'm going to see how many we can get through, and then we might ask for others in addition. But let me begin with the many great questions we have, because we are also going to be closing with a call for action, and we want to be sure to have time for you to be in that conversation. I'm going to invite anyone from any of our speakers to respond to these questions. And since we're not actually on a raised platform, I'd like to recommend that if you are answering, to please stand in your place and perhaps hold the microphone so folks in the back can see who's speaking. Is that okay with you? All right, great. So here's the first question that actually I'm sure many of you are interested in. The writer says, I'd like to have this information to share with my county's legislators, business leaders, health and early childhood, community leaders, and certainly to parents. Is there an economical way to have this message presented to my county? And actually, I was thinking, Stephanie, you might be a good one. You may need to just pick up the whole thing. Okay.
Thanks for that question, Maggie. You know, you may notice that we've been able to tape this. And so what we're going to do is post the video in segments on YouTube. We are moving into the new world.
Woohoo!
We're going to post it on YouTube in segments. So each one of the speakers, you'll be able to download it from there and then share it in whatever way you would like to do that. As far as the written materials, we're certainly, the North Carolina Partnership for Children and the rest of the coalition that's made this possible will make those available to you if you'd like to have them. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And we do appreciate the interest in getting this message out, because again, Stephanie will be talking a little bit more about where do we go from here, because this is absolutely the beginning of a dialogue. So here's a question, Dr. Shonkoff, this might be geared to you. How does science account for the child whose parents were not college educated, whose mother was on welfare, who experienced homelessness, substance abuse, and violence throughout early childhood, but experienced educational, social, and emotional success in adulthood? How does that one work?
That's easy.
Okay, please.
Well, first of all, neither of my parents went to college, and my father didn't graduate high school. I mean, science has a very clear answer to that. There is a wide range of variability in kind of genetic predisposition and all of the things we're talking about. So everybody is born with a wide range of possibilities of what he or she is capable of doing. And some people's range is over here, and some people's range is over here, and a lot of overlap. So what determines where you are in your range is a result of the interaction between what you've been endowed with genetically and what your life opportunities are. So anybody could end up on one end of the spectrum or the other in terms of your own possibilities, based in part on it's a mix of risk factors and protective factors, and a lot of who knows, right? But I think the more important response to that is that there will always be examples of people who overcame great odds, and we have a huge scientific literature on that. I mean, Emmy Werner's study on the Isle of Kauai, and the studies of kids who've grown up in poverty, kids who survived wars, kids who have terrible diseases, and they're among the consistent things that come out of all of those studies are, and it gets back to the secretary's comment, there's nobody who kind of made it on his or her own without at least one person having played a really important role. Nobody, ever. And I think the problem in the policy arena is that we should all not be paying the price for the extraordinary individual who overcame all odds and say that the policy answer is you should all be like him. You know, it's the other thing about the brain is designed to get on track. It's not designed to go bad. It's designed to go good. And when bad things happen, the brain is organized to make the best of what it has. So the odds are in our favor. All we have to do is provide an environment in which every kid has a chance to make it. And in the end, we'll have a normal distribution. There'll be people at one end and people at the other. It's this issue of closing the achievement gap. I mean, I think there'll always be a gap. There'll always be people at the top and people at the bottom. The question is, how can we tolerate people falling off the bottom when we're not giving them a chance? So Horatio Alger is very alive in this country, but we can't all be like Horatio Alger.
Great. Best and most realistic strategies to improve infant toddler care. I gave you a chance to run out of the room.
Yep.
You missed it.
I don't think there's a single strategy. High quality infant toddler care is quite expensive, and I think we have to be judicious in how we allocate our resources to make sure that we get that high quality care to those who need it the most. So I'd say that's one thing we need to do, is target that care, make sure it's high quality and target it to the most need. In the longer run, I think we should look at policies of other developed nations in the world that have provided some kind of parental leave for most families in those countries. That often is done outside of the tax system, more through an insurance type system. But I think we have to look at that as an alternative from other countries as well.
Just briefly, I think I want to really reinforce Dick's last point, which is that there is no reason why we shouldn't make it easier for people to stay home with their kids, and most people don't have a choice. Our policies only give the choice to half the population who can afford to go without income, and that's a non-starter. The other thing on the child care side, I would say for infant and toddler care, probably the most important thing we can do is to be able to appropriately compensate a workforce that won't keep leaving their jobs. That's the greatest threat. It's not a curriculum issue for infants, it's the fact that people can't stay.
What do we know about how best to prepare an early childhood workforce to promote supportive interactions and relationships with children? So what do we know about how to best prepare an early childhood workforce to promote these supportive interactions and relationships with children?
Well, I have a couple of comments I'd like to make about that. I think some of you know that I'm on the teacher advisory board, so I have to acknowledge that conflict of interest here. But we do have mechanisms for helping people increase their education levels in North Carolina and around the country. And I think it's quite important that we do that in a way that makes that available to a broad spectrum of our population, not just to all those who are already highly educated and well-to-do. We need a diverse workforce for working with young children. So something like that, our community colleges offer a wonderful opportunity for the first step in that process, but we need to move on beyond that toward 4-year college education as well.
More comments? All right. So here's a little bit about stress in the current economy. So would the stress of lengthy unemployment on parents translate into tolerant or toxic stress on the young child? And there's a follow-up question. Please go ahead.
That's an easy one.
Okay.
The difference between positive, tolerable, and toxic stress is not what's causing the stress. It's whether people are alone or whether they have support to deal with it. So whatever there is to come, and I think everything we've been hearing is telling us that we're in for some really bad times for some period of time. But the only question is how many people will be left without any support to help get through, and how many will be provided with support. And I think the first line of support is the family. The second line of support is the extended family and the neighbors. And the third line of support is the community. And generally that works for most people. And when, for that part of the population for whom it doesn't work, the science says that even something the government pays for could provide good support. Even if people happen to have professional degrees, even if they're tied up in programs, the key issue is support. It's not what's causing the stress.
All right.
I'd like to make
Please, a couple more comments. Go ahead.
I think an issue for us, particularly in North Carolina, as we head into this downturn, is that we make resources continually available to families. I'm quite worried about families being ruled as ineligible for child care because they've been moved out of the workforce. They've lost their jobs. So that we need to make sure that our rules are flexible enough and maybe make some exceptions during this very difficult time, that makes sure that families are not children bounced in and out of childcare during their time when their parents are having to look for work.
And it's something else about what to do about the tough times. There really is a very strong case to be made for getting beyond this issue of not wanting to have to be responsible for other people's children. I mean, I think what the science shows us is that, and then if we put it in the context of a lot of the political realities right now, is that every privileged child's future is going to be affected by how many of the children who are not as privileged are going to share the burden of paying for Social Security, Medicare, national defense, and the interest on the public debt. That's a huge, I don't know the numbers, but on every kid, every baby born today is facing a huge financial burden that's going to have to be paid for decades and decades and decades. And the extent to which some part of the population is not going to be able to help carry that load is going to intensify the burden on those who are born in privilege, which is not even getting to the fact of how expensive it's going to be to pay for prison and unemployment. So, I mean, one way to frame this in terms of the budget debates, I think, but I'm not a political expert. But when the question comes up is where should the money come from? Whoever is in charge of the budget for the penal system and whoever's in charge for the budget for A, B, and C, has a vested interest in how what we do in early childhood is going to affect that budget that's going to be taken care of by his successor. So we have to somehow get this away from paying for other people's children and recognizing that this is really paying for everybody's children and the integrity of the society.
Great. While I continue with some of the questions on the cards, I've turned on the microphones that are on each side. We can probably take a couple questions from each microphone. So if there's something else that's being sparked for you, and I'm not sure if our audio people's here, I'm getting a little feedback, but you're welcome to come up to the microphones and we'll intersperse you with the notes on the cards. So actually this is, we have an important military presence in North Carolina. So let me ask actually a follow-up question related to that. So what do you think the effects on children with parents experiencing post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder or milder forms of stress disorders due to war or prolonged deployments? The effects on children with parents who are, do you want to say more? Same, I'm hearing same question, same answer?
Well, it is the same answer. All of these stresses are serious burdens on children, including very young children, but it doesn't mean that we can't help them get through. I think that's why, it's wonderful to see in the country how uniformly supportive everyone is of the military. But it's so funny how just as you said that, I thought of another thing to say about the military related to the child care issue. I'm sure most people know this, but it's worth repeating. Mm-hmm. The best early care and education system in the country is provided by the military. It far exceeds anything that any state has done. In fact, the question before is, which state has shown you can do it? No state, but the military has really shown how to do it, and there's a history behind that. But there's a lesson to be learned from that also. The reason the military has the best early care and education system in the country is that it invests in it. And the reason it invests in it is because of two major points. One is the military's workforce is in the childbearing years, a large part of it. And the military knows that soldiers can't do their jobs, men and women, if there isn't good care provided for their kids. And the military also understands that a large percentage of military personnel come from military families, so the military is investing in its future workforce. I think, if we could put the military up as our model of how to do it, and it's, we could say, yeah, but the military gets all the money it needs, but maybe it doesn't. But that's where they've proved it can be done.
Great. And let me remind you, if you have particular questions, you're welcome to come up to the microphones. So, Dr. Shonkoff, you stated that we needed more than intervention or weekly home visitation programs or other types of interventions, giving parents books for children and teaching them to read. So we need more than all of that. So the question is this: Can you give a couple of examples of specific family interventions that you would recommend, especially for families with children from birth to 2 years of age? And Dick, you might also have a comment on that.
I just feel bad that I'm answering.
No, go ahead. It's for you.
That's why we brought you here.
That's why you're here.
Well, we actually have a project we have a project in Tulsa right now, actually, where we're just kind of trying to put our money or someone else's money where our mouth is. Because I think if we just go by the data that are in the literature, and again, I think most people in the audience, a lot of people know this. So for very young, for birth to 3 or prenatal to 3, the program that has the best data is the Nurse-Family Partnership, and it's demonstrated through randomized controlled trials that it can affect outcomes. But beyond that, we still have a lot of people arguing about what the outcomes mean in a lot of studies. So what we're doing in Tulsa is trying to see if we can actually develop and implement models that go beyond these current programs, and it relates to the last slide I mentioned. So we're trying to put a program together where we're kind of really integrating mental health expertise into the early care and education setting in a birth to 5 setting, rather than relying primarily on good referrals to mental health services, is to do more professional development and teach people who work in programs how to deal with a lot of behavioral and emotional issues in a preventive way, and then to kind of deal with problems that occur. The other thing that we're focusing on is the staff, because in fact in this particular program in Tulsa, they did a recent survey and there was a higher prevalence of depression among staff than there was among parents. And that's a real issue, which is not surprising, particularly in programs where a lot of the staff come from the community. Why would you expect that the ratios would be any different? We're also integrating a workforce development and an economic security piece to this. And we have economists working with us, helping us figure out creative ways to pay for all this with money that's already in existing systems, because I don't think will be well served by anything that makes a big impact but that costs too much money. So I know in the mental health area, it's not my expertise, but the mental health economists we work with say that there's actually a huge amount of money in the mental health system, most of which goes to very expensive institutional care, and that redirecting some of that money toward more community-based prevention services could do a lot without trying to find new funds. So I think the bottom line here is to start working on the things that we all know are the big problems: mental health, economic security, fragmentation, poor implementation, and try to do something about it. But in the end, for the very young kids, it's all about the relationships. It's not about a curriculum. It's about stable, nurturing relationships. And we've got, and that's easy to describe, but hard to do.
Well, actually, here's another question that relates to social emotional development, and I think you began to answer this, but let me ask this question specifically. So, although there's been some progress in recognizing the fact that cognitive skills and social emotional skills are intertwined, social emotional development is still overlooked by many decision makers. So, can you comment on that and suggest some strategies to move beyond that, from a policy perspective, decision-making processes, any systems change? What will really make the shift?
Getting this knowledge and information accessible to decision makers. Decision makers are very smart, and they, across the political spectrum, I found very few decision makers who don't want to see good things happen for kids. I think part of this is an educational issue. People don't know this. But then the bigger challenge, I think, is to say, okay, I see it's important, so what should we do? And I think this is where the practice community, kind of has to help in terms of specifics. But I think this is, my experience has been that as people learn about this more, they're very supportive of it. We saw some big changes in some very conservative states we've worked in, where people have made real commitments to, Kansas being one example.
What happened there in particular that made that shift?
We told people the same thing that I told you this morning, and but the key thing is that we don't go around and give the science and then tell people what to do. We go around and give the science, and we invite the different kind of discussion. Nobody's going to come in from another state and tell people what to do.
Oh,
No
I know
less
North
from-
Carolina likes that.
But I think it changes the nature of the policy discussion. Without this, the policy discussion usually gets stuck in a debate between whether this is personal responsibility or public responsibility. And I've never in my life ever seen that argument result in somebody changing his or her mind about what his basic values are. So what our strategy is to not start with kind of where the political lines are drawn, but to ask people to, at least initially, kind of take your politics off the table while we just share with you what your tax dollars have paid for in terms of all this science that we've developed over the last several years. We put the science on the table, and then it's a different discussion. I won't mention names, but in one setting with a very conservative, very powerful state legislator in one state, we had a session and presented some work that was done on impact of early separation. These were monkey studies, looking at what happens when critical and sensitive periods of separating baby monkeys from their mothers and what it did to their behavior, what it did to their brain development, and how there was a sensitive period after which it was too late to change. Just presented that stuff. He listened to that and he said, "This is making me think about our foster care system and the way in which we kind of have," and we were off to the races. If we'd come in and said, "You have a terrible foster care system," that nobody's going to listen. So I think it's teaching people about the science instead of preaching to them what they should do. And it's magic. I can tell you from personal experience, it's magic. It's a different conversation. Instead of saying, "Why should we do it?" people say, "So how can we figure out what to do given the limited resources we have?" And that's a huge step forward.
Wow, wonderful. Dr. Huff?
Are you able to hear me? Is this phone on okay?
Yes, it is.
All right, my name is Olson Huff, and I'm very interested in the mix of people that are here today because so many of us represent people who've been involved in concerns about early childhood development for many, many years. I suspect, too, in the audience, I know there are a few of us who are pediatricians, but I'm not sure the medical profession is as well represented here as it should be. One of the concerns that I have relative to the brain research that you so eloquently presented to us is, are we training the future healthcare providers to know this clearly so that when they're called on to be responsible for interpreting this to the communities in which they live and practice, are they going to be able to do it correctly? And also, are we going to be training these healthcare providers who are in the business of prevention even before people become pregnant, during the pregnancy, and surrounding the early few hours of a child's life? How are we preparing this future medical workforce to deal with this?
Well, I am a pediatrician by training. I was in academic pediatrics for about 15 years before I moved into a different line of work. I'm not as on the ground in touch with things as I was, but I still stay in touch. And I would say the answer to your question is we could be doing a lot better. We're not doing a great job. And that's a different set of politics. That's the politics of medical schools and hospitals and medical education. And it's a different limited resource. It's teaching time. And it's also a different limited resource of expertise. Think about this. How do you give pediatricians a grounding in this in a 1-month rotation out of 3 years of training? That's the problem. And so it's, I think people are still fighting that battle, but you put your finger on an important issue, I think. It's sad that pediatricians are not as well trained about this as they need to be. And I think also behavioral and developmental pediatrics needs to be much more involved in policy issues than just clinical issues, because the biggest threats to children's development are not solved in a doctor's office. They're solved in a community. So it's a long haul, but I think you're absolutely right. People need to keep plugging away at that. But the bottom line for all of this, and I really mean this, I learned this just over the last couple of years, and I wish I'd learned it early in my career, because I spent a lot of years, kind of figuratively up on a soapbox, just ranting and raving about how children are our future and that we should be doing what's good for kids, until I finally got in my head. I actually learned a lot of this from working more with people in the business community. I love working with business people now because they're about, like, what are you trying to do, and how are you going to do it, and what's it going to cost, and how do you know you're succeeding? And I love that, because what it does is it changes your whole approach. And instead of preaching, you kind of try to get down to what it is we want to do and what's it going to cost. And just to repeat the thing I said before, we have found unbelievable success in changing the nature of what the policy debate is all about by giving people mastery of this science. How could you know this and not just approach this in a different way other than just arguing about individual responsibility? It's like, it's not saying, not saying the government raises kids. It does. Families raise kids, communities raise kids, but the government obviously plays a role in either facilitating that or not. And so it's changing the nature of the dialogue. That's what I feel we're trying to do, change the environment in which the political decisions are made by having it be more sophisticated about this science. It's mind-boggling. This science is transforming treatment of disease. It's transforming the way people are going to work in hospitals. It needs to also transform the way we think about community development and education, because it's the same science. It's all human. It's all about human capital. It comes down to that. And I think we're making a lot of progress.
Great. I think that's a perfect place to end with the beginning of a dialogue. So let me first thank all of our speakers for this portion of the Q&A.